First of all, Mr. Chomsky, I would like to thank you for giving me this great opportunity to meet you. And I would like to give another thanks for your participation in the international hunger strike that I started in Syria at the end of 2013 to stand against the Assad starvation weapon. Thank you so much, sir.
Pleased to be with you.
Okay. I would like to start by asking you about your motivation when you decided to join the international hunger strike for Syria. What was your motive to do that?
Well, what's happening in Syria is an indescribable crime and disaster. I mean, the country is literally being destroyed. The population is being devastated. Whether Syria will ever recover as a viable entity is not clear. So anything symbolic or concrete that can be done is almost a duty, a responsibility. There's no question of motivation.
Okay. Right now, all we can hear on the news when we hear people talking about Syria is ISIS and how to solve the problem without mentioning or describing all what's going on in Syria as a civil war. What do you have to say? Let's say if you were right now on TV and people asked you, what do you think that happened from Syria and what did got Syria to this horrible situation right now?
Well, Syria had been on the fringe of the so-called Arab Spring when the first efforts were made to call for peaceful reform, mild changes, completely nonviolent protests. The government responded with extreme brutality and violence, actually so extreme that it finally elicited a militant response. And that led to vicious acts on the part of the regime. I mean, indescribably vicious acts. And in the usual dynamics of conflict, what happens is that the more harsh and brutal elements tend to come to the fore, and others, more moderate, conciliatory, are pushed to the side. That's the dynamics of military confrontation. The harshest and most brutal elements become prominent. And by now it's turned into an utter monstrosity. As far as ISIS is concerned, its origins lie in the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq. In fact, one of the leading U.S. specialists on the Middle East, Graham Fuller, long background in CIA, other intelligence, has a recent article in which the title is something like "The U.S. Created ISIS." He says, I don't mean that Washington sat down and planned ISIS. It's just that the actions that were taken in Iraq steadily led to the emergence of utterly monstrous outgrowth, which is a kind of an extremist fringe of the already extremist Wahhabi ideology that Saudi Arabia has promulgated, both ideologically and with funding, already extremist within Islam, and this is an extremist fringe of that, which is, unfortunately, it's the situation in Iraq and Syria is so chaotic and destructive that it apparently people are willing to accept the rule of ISIS, horrible as it is, if it at least imposes a bit of order. Rather, like what happened in Afghanistan when the Taliban came. People hated them, but they were welcomed because it was an improvement over the terrible destructiveness and chaos caused by the warlord conflicts.
So what I understand from your words is dictatorship will always motivate or create extremism.
Internally, it will, as long if it's resisted,
Yeah,
and if it crushes resistance,
yeah.
that leads to militancy, which then inspires greater violence on the part of the regime and takeover of resistance by more militant and brutal elements.
When I was in Syria, sir, since the beginning of the revolution, I saw with my own eyes how the regime was always going after the educated and the moderate people, throw them in jail, and at the same time getting out the people who have extremist background or have related with Al Qaeda, because we know in 2003 the Assad regime helped a lot of extremists to go to Iraq and fight the American invasion. What we were trying to tell people right now and trying to convince them that the regime had a lot of a big role in creating these extremist groups by capturing the moderate and the educated people in Syria and releasing these extremist people. I don't know if you have any information about that, or I don't know if you share the same vision with me.
Well, it's a pretty common feature of harsh and brutal regimes. They do not want a moderate opposition because that would lead to reform.
Yeah.
If the opposition they face becomes violent, terrorist, and brutal, then that's the terrain on which they can operate. After all, these are regimes based on force, based on violence. The terrain in which they function is the terrain of violence, not conciliation, compromise, negotiated progress. So of course they want to shift things to that domain.
We remember in 2013, the regime in August 21st used massive amounts of sarin gas to attack civilian populations. The United States used just a threat of power, using power against the regime, and that was enough for Bashar al-Assad to give up all of his, or let's say most of his chemical stocks. Wouldn't you think that sometimes just showing some kind of threat of using power could have saved a lot of lives in Syria? If, let's say, for example, the United States international community asked Bashar al-Assad to step down or start negotiating a political solution, or otherwise he will be forced with power.
But that's not what happened. What happened is that the giving up the chemical weapons did not threaten the survival of the regime. What the West proposed and what you're repeating is that they should demand the end of the regime. Now, Assad can't just step down. If Assad steps down, first of all, he'll get killed. His associates will get killed. His supporters will get killed. And they're not going to do that. If the only option offered to them is basically suicide, the answer will be they'll just become more violent, because they're not going to say, okay, I'll cut my throat. Brahimi's proposals were different. He was proposing, as I understand it, a negotiated settlement which would leave some, at least transitional, role for the regime to survive as part of some kind of an agreement, with the expectation that over time they could be removed from power, maybe go for refuge somewhere else, but not just commit suicide. The West wouldn't accept that. And the proposal, the negotiated proposal that you're describing, basically from the Assad point of view, we have to ask, what does it mean from their point of view, would be, should we cut our throats? Shall we abandon our position? They're not going to accept that. That's not a significant negotiating proposal.
Going back to the chemical weapons attack, I was there. I was in Muaddamiyah, Damascus suburbs, when the regime used chemical weapons. I heard the missiles coming from Damascus, the regime's strong held area. I was practically dead for almost an hour after inhaling a lot of, big amount of sarin gas. And 5 days later, the United Nations sent their investigators and went inside. Escorted them personally, and they examined patients, evidence, the rockets, and some of the crashing sites. And they wrote a full report that shows that, like I said, the rockets were fired from a regime-held area when they calculated the angle of the missiles when they hit the ground. Every once and then I hear a lot of conspiracy theories saying that it was Al-Qaeda who did that, or Turkey, or I don't know, sometimes a lot of other crazy theories. What do you think about the chemical weapons attack that happened in August 21st, 2013? Who did it and who's responsible?
Well, there are two questions embodied in that. One is what my personal opinion is. The second is what the investigators and other analysts discovered. Now, if you take a look at the UN report, they're pretty cautious not to assign blame.
Yes.
So they gave evidence, but they didn't draw any conclusion about who was responsible. If you ask my personal opinion, I never had any doubt that it was the regime. I don't see anybody else who could have done it, but my personal opinion doesn't count. What matters is what the investigators discovered, and they left an ambiguous picture.
I read the United Nations report. The investigators said that they calculated the angle of the missiles when it hit, and they linked it to Qasiyun Mountain and to other areas in Damascus, which is a stronghold for the regime. And in the same time, like we discussed earlier, after the United States threat using power to against the regime after using the chemical weapons, the regime gave up his chemical stocks, including sarin gas that he used, which he never acknowledged existence until after that attack.
Whatever the UN investigator may have told you personally, that's not what is in the report.
Yes.
What is in the report very explicitly holds back from assigning specific responsibility. So if you ask me, my personal opinion, my personal opinion, yes, it almost certainly was the regime. As for giving up the weapons, yes, they gave up the weapons, but crucially, that did not threaten the existence of the regime, whereas the negotiating offers made by the West did not only threaten, but insist on ending the regime. That's a crucial difference. When you approach a dictatorship which has a violent history and has just been carrying out atrocious acts, creating a system in which any giving up their power will mean effectively suicide, not only personally, but for the Alawite community, then if that is not a negotiating position they can possibly accept.
My final question is, I come from Palestinian origins, and my father had to leave Palestine in 1948, and I was born and raised in Syria. When the Syrian revolution started, I was very disappointed, like the rest of the Syrian people, of all the peace movements and other organizations who supported the Palestinian cause, but never supported the Syrian revolution. And they always talked about the Israeli crimes against Palestinians in Palestine, but they never mentioned the Palestinians who were trapped in the Yarmouk camp, for example, where over 50,000 people were starving to death, and the highest numbers of people who starved to death was Palestinians in the Yarmouk camp. What do you think is the reason, and what do you have to say to these organizations who only see what's going on in the Middle East just from one eye and putting a blind eye on the other things?
Well, I've been involved in Palestinian solidarity activity since the 1940s. when you talk about peace movement supporting the Palestinians, bear in mind that this is after many, many decades. It took a long time to develop any form of solidarity with the Palestinians. Take right here where we're sitting at MIT. Up until about maybe 10 years ago, if I gave a talk on Palestine here at MIT, I had to have police protection because of the violent response. Meetings were broken up and so on. That's after many decades of violence and oppression. It takes a long time to build up a solidarity movement of any kind. It can't be done overnight. In the case of what you're describing is a horror story. And there was no reaction, there was some, of course, but no significant reaction in a very brief period before the information was even coming out. So sure, it's wrong, but it's not a surprise.
Do you support Geneva? Do you find that Geneva offer was a good way to solve the problems, the crisis in Syria?
There is no good way to solve the problems. As I said, there are slim hopes. Geneva was ambiguous. One strain of the Geneva offers, which as far as I understand it were Brahimi's proposals,
yes,
were to allow some kind of participation of the horrifying Assad regime within a transitional system. The Western proposals, which were different, were to insist on their instant dissolution as a condition for the negotiations. That was not going to get anywhere. They're not going to commit suicide.
But at the end, America, Russia, and most of the Western powers, they signed up for Geneva and they supported Geneva, and the only party who refused Geneva was the regime.
Well, I don't see it that way. Yes, you're right. They supported Geneva in their terms.
Yes.
And for the West, not Russia, that meant that Assad had to immediately step down as a precondition for the negotiations.
Okay. If you have a vision, or let's say a way you can see that it's possible to solve the Syrian crisis, what would it be?
The hopes are very slim, but the only hope I can see is some kind of putting aside ISIS, which I don't see any solution for other than military. Putting aside ISIS, you can imagine a negotiated settlement of the kind that Brahimi was trying to construct, which would include the Assad regime in some kind of transitional system. Now, that would mean also enlisting them as part of the anti-ISIS coalition,
yes,
which would maybe lead to a transitional period in which the peaceful, moderate reformist elements could find a place and move towards incorporating, reconstructing Syria from the disaster in which it now exists. That incidentally would also mean either autonomy or independence for Rojava, for the Kurdish areas. Okay. We haven't mentioned that, but that's a crucial part of it.
Okay. Speaking about that, people in Syria, the majority of the people who stood up against the regime, and they had to pay a massive bill of blood and torture and ruins, and they lost their families and friends. When they look and see that after 4 years of Assad brutality, the world didn't take any kind of action or punishment against what Bashar did, but when ISIS existed and started doing their awful and brutal things, all the world came together. Over 40 countries, they collaborated to start attacking ISIS. ISIS is providing a propaganda saying that they are here to protect the Sunnah from the oppression that they've been facing during the past 4 or 5 decades. Don't you think, sir, that targeting only targeting ISIS without targeting the source or the reasons that created ISIS, which is dictatorships,
No.
will only strengthen ISIS, and it will only support their propaganda.
In the case of ISIS, as compared with Assad, there's a very simple reason for the difference in the reaction. Assad was perfectly tolerable to the West. He was a kind of an ally, often an explicit ally. In fact, if you look at the early stages of the current civil war, uprising and repression, if the United States and Israel had wanted to support the resistance to Assad, there were very simple things they could have done, very simple. For example, Israel could have mobilized forces in the Golan Heights, just mobilized forces, not shoot a bullet. That would have compelled Assad to move forces to the south. It's happened before, yes, which would have relieved pressure against the early resistance. They never made a move to do that. Never a discussion. It's not a matter, not even providing arms, just mobilized forces. Reason is that Assad was more maybe they didn't love him, but that he was more tolerable to them than the alternatives. Yeah. ISIS is different. It's a threat to their interests, and therefore they responded. We may not like it, but that's the way systems of power work. It's an ugly world. We have to recognize the way it works and adopt tactics and proposals with an understanding of how power interests operate.
Okay. It's been an honor and pleasure meeting you, sir, and thank you again so much for giving us the chance to talk. And again, I would like to thank you for your participation in the hunger strike, and I really wish that we can stay connected and maybe discuss some ideas about helping, especially the besieged civilians in Syria. I will provide you with the data that you asked for, and inshallah we'll stay in touch. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, sir.